view. So, Monica, what is the motivation behind these interviews in these new places? Is there any internal polling amid the campaign that shows that she's got some weak spots she needs to address?
Well, the Harris campaign really feels, Katie, that they're entering into this narrow stretch where people are tuning in more acutely. And so this is the moment to try to appear to a really broad swath of the audience on a lot of different kinds of platforms. And that is why you're seeing her do a few more podcasts and potentially entertaining more. She's going and trying to do a media blitz on all sorts of kinds of reach and opportunity like Fox News. And we're told that they do believe there's a sliver of the electorate that watches and tunes into Fox News that they claim is undecided, that could still be making up their mind. Maybe some of them are people like those who are going to be appearing alongside her today, shortly, just minutes from now, who are a part of those anti-Trump Republicans who might still watch Fox News but aren't necessarily enthralled with what he represents as the leader of the GOP right now. They're hoping to maybe appeal to some of those people with an interview like the one we're going to see today with Bret Baier. But there's also this idea of the Republican voter who maybe supported Nikki Haley, for instance. And we saw in places like this, in some key counties and key battlegrounds, that even after Nikki Haley left the race, there was some support for her that wasn't completely insignificant. And so the Harris campaign is trying to go after some of those types of people who are attending this event here, which isn't really a rally. It's a couple hundred of those so-called Republicans for Harris. And you're going to hear a little bit more of that message, which is meant to be this country over party. But they're just at this phase, Katie, where they're trying everything, and they want her to be as really viewable and as available to some of these interviews that she certainly wasn't doing some weeks ago when they said this will come at some point. We're now in that window, and that's why they say they're really trying to lean into it a bit more aggressively. We'll see if that pays off at all in some of these, again, really key counties where they're hoping just a tiny margin victory could make all the difference.
She's also been saying that she wants people to pay attention to Donald Trump more. She says on the campaign trail, you should go to one of his rallies, or you should watch one of his rallies. You should really listen. She's now starting to play some of Donald Trump at her own rallies. Who does she think she's getting when she does that?
And that was the very first time we saw that in this same Commonwealth. It was in Erie, Pennsylvania on Monday. The fact that she's back here on Wednesday also just tells you a lot about where the campaign is viewing their strategy of where they want to spend their time. But she did play that montage, specifically that language about Donald Trump saying there's a, quote, enemy from within, and threatening to use potentially the National Guard or aspects of the military against his critics and detractors. That is something that they do have internal campaign polling on that I've reported, Katie, that does show them that when they lean into and try to tell people what Donald Trump has said, what he has specifically threatened, what he was like when he was in office, and what he could be like if he returns there, they do see a bit of an opportunity of voters that do want to hear more about that and are a little bit more receptive to that. So that's why you're seeing her do more of it. And I'm told that will only continue and ramp up in these final 20 days.
So I'm wondering if you take the opposite approach, though, and you say, is it a good idea for her to, is it a good idea for her to be out there with Liz Cheney and other Republicans doing all of these events in swing states to try to convince that sliver of Republican voters who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump to vote for her? Or is it a better idea to double down on the Democrats, double down on the base of the Democratic Party, the traditional base, and the coalition that President Obama put together? Why not see him more with her on the campaign trail in some of these swing places? I know he's been going out on his own. Have you got an explanation from the campaign about that? Maybe they think they can do both.
Yeah, there is clearly what the campaign would say, which is that yesterday, for instance, she focused almost entirely on reaching out and trying to earn the support of black men. And that is, as you point out, what former President Obama has been trying to do as well. So that they can do that day to day, that they know that window and the runway is limited, but they can dedicate an entire couple of days to that key message. and then dedicate a day like today to trying to continue that outreach to Republicans. And you do talk about, well, what is the balance of that? That's certainly for any campaign something they need to evaluate, but they feel right now like they're trying to at least lean into where they do see some opportunity, which is a reflection. They're going to argue today of the dozens and dozens of anti-Trump Republicans who've already endorsed her, that there could be a few more out there in the next few weeks who could have some influence, people who work directly with Donald Trump or for Donald Trump, and they believe that specifically that can create a permission structure for others, independents perhaps, which they will need if they want to win in some of these places.
Well, there's an argument out there that perhaps maybe there's a risk there as well, that what you're telling Democratic voters is that there's not going to be, ones who want change, there might not be as much change if you're bringing in some establishment Republican figures or extremely conservative Republican figures to your cause, like Liz Cheney. Obviously, who knows? I'm just telling you what's out there. Monica Alva, thank you very much. By the way, so Kamala Harris is in Bucks County today. I'm going to note and flag this. Nikki Haley won that county, won 12,000 votes in that county. If they all went to Donald Trump, that'd be 19% of, all went to Kamala Harris, that'd be 19% of the vote there.